Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about the changes caused by Brexit to UK trade, particularly how it has affected how traders operate with the country's ports. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Institute of Export and International Trade in partnership with Hutchison Ports. My name is William Barnes-Graham, the Senior Content Editor at the Institute, and I will be your host for the next hour or so. And it's great to see so many of you on today's call, particularly given this is a postponed session. It was originally planned for October, so thank you for all of your flexibility in making it to today's date. Next slide, please. Here you'll see that we have two fantastic speakers today from both the Institute and Hutchison Ports. Later on, we'll be hearing from Kevin Shakespeare, the Director of the Institute's Academy, and a regular on our webinar programme, as some of you will know. But before Kevin, we'll be hearing from Paul Davey, the Head of Corporate Affairs at Hutchison Ports, who, as you can see from the slide, has vast experience in the transport and logistics slide through his time with Port of Felixstowe in particular. You can read more about our esteemed speakers on the slide here, and we'll be sharing this pack with you all afterwards as well. But on the next slide, before we get properly started, we're going to run a quick poll to get a sense of who you, our audience, are. So I'm just going to launch this poll. And we are asking you, have you made any Brexit-related changes to your import or export arrangements? And the options are yes, no but planning to, no and do not need to, or not sure. Now, while you are answering that poll, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Firstly, you can contact me with any comments or questions using the question panel on the control window to the right-hand side of your screen. We hope to get to a number of your questions towards the end of the webinar, though please bear in mind, we always receive a lot of questions in advance, so we cannot guarantee we'll get through everything today, but we'll try our best. If you feel as though your question has not been answered, please do review our technical helpline or training and consultancy offerings, which we'll talk about later in the webinar. Secondly, you will receive access to today's slide pack and a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email we will be sending over the next day or so. So please do try to listen in as carefully as possible to today's presentation. Righty ho, I'll give you a couple more seconds to answer the poll. And I will close that now. So just to share the results. So unsurprisingly, 3/4 of you have had to make Brexit-related changes to your imports or exports. 3% say no, but not planning to. Further 12% no and do not need to, and 11% not sure. So thank you everyone for answering that poll. As ever, really interesting results. So on that note, on the next slide, that's enough of me, and over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Will, for the introduction. And it actually seems strangely appropriate that this webinar has been postponed once or twice already, because if anything characterises Brexit, it's postponement, really indeed. Even the title, How has Brexit Impacted Goods Movements, was set because when we originally set the date for this, most of the Brexit changes should have taken place already, but actually haven't. So perhaps it should be how Brexit will impact good movement through UK ports. Also, I think just before I begin, if I can, just a little bit of sort of small print on it. The whole Brexit situation, I'm sure everyone's aware, is extremely complicated. It's especially complicated for control goods and those that need sort of special certificates or permissions. I'm not going to even attempt to go into that level of detail, but just try and give really an overview of how it's going to affect ports and the port sector primarily, at least. So before I begin, I think this might be the third of this series of sort of Hutchison supported webinars that most of you have sat through. So I'll try and scoot through the introductory slides really quickly, but if we could have the next slide, please, Will. So thanks. So Hutchison Ports is part of the CK Hutchison Group. It's a large Hong Kong-based conglomerate, one of the biggest inward investors in the UK, and Hutchison itself operates the world's leading port network. So again, you can read the numbers: 52 ports in 26 countries, Next slide, please. 12 of those ports are in Europe. They include major ports such as Rotterdam, Barcelona, but also a number of inland ports as well in Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and 3 UK ports as well. Next slide, please. So the largest of our 3 UK ports is the Port of Felixstowe. It's the UK's largest container port, handles about 40% of all UK traffic, around 3 million TEUs per year, primarily container port, but we also have 3 daily ferry services over to North Europe as well. Next slide, please, Will. Harwich International Port is, just those who know the geography, only about 1.5 miles on the other side of the river from Felixstowe here, where I'm speaking to you from as well. It's a first-class ro-ro port primarily, but it also handles some conventional cargoes, some project cargoes, and some bulk cargoes as well. Next slide, please. And the third of the 3 ports is London Thames Port, down on the River Medway on the Isle of Grain. It's primarily a short sea container port and handling some conventional and project cargoes as well. So I think probably that's enough about Hutchison for now. We can come back to Hutchison later if anyone wants to, but if you have next slide, please, Will. So the story so far, Brexit. It seems to me sometimes that I've been dealing with Brexit for sort of half my life, but in fact it's only, and I use the term lightly, 5 years so far. Well, I think it's 5 years, and I counted this morning, 5 years and 152 days, actually, but then who is counting on this? It has been a saga. I won't go through the full saga. We've all lived through it. But after numerous delays, backbench rebellions, government defeats, change of prime minister, a general election, the UK finally and formally left the European Union at 11 p.m. on the 31st of January last year. However, although we had nominally left the EU at that point, we actually first went into the transition period. That ran through to the end of 2020. And during that time, we remained members of both the single market and the customs union. So to all intents and purposes, and particularly in transport and shipping, very little had actually changed before then. Next slide, please, Will. So yeah, the first tranche of changes sort of kicked in on the 1st of January this year when export declarations were required for UK cargoes, and the EU started to treat the UK as a third country. There's goods moving from the UK into the EU had to go through all the normal import procedures on the EU end, at least. We were due to reciprocate full border controls on imports on the 1st of July this year, but after a couple of delays, first time to the 1st of January and next year, they're not now going to be introduced until the 1st of July 2022. And in fact, just last week, there are a few further delays announced to checks on dairy products and certain other products of animal origin, mostly composite foodstuffs, which won't come in now until later in 2022. There have been sort of various reasons given for these series of delays, but officially at least, it was down to, or said to be due to the impacts of the pandemic on traders' preparations, and that the delays would give traders and shippers more time to prepare for the changes that will come around as part of Brexit. And as I mentioned already, and as life in general, really, with Brexit in particular, the devil really is in the detail. So next slide, please, Will. So a tiny bit of the detail. About 75% of the checks that we do on non-EU products at Felixstowe are undertaken by Port Health. Mostly that's on food, but also products of animal origin, which are not for human consumption. And it's those, but also, and importantly, I think for the EU trade, plants and plant products, the majority of which come from the EU, that are going to be the subject of the majority of physical checks imports from next year. I think Kevin, who's speaking after me, will say quite a bit more on the detail for plant and animal products, but perhaps sort of the key point for now and the things that are going to change on the 1st of January is that all importers, forwards and transport operators, they'll all be affected, is that customs declarations will need to be made on the 1st of January, from the 1st of January, and ports will have to control goods. Now, I'll say a bit more about controlling goods in a minute, but basically, if the goods aren't cleared, they can't leave the port. So if you don't do your declarations, the goods can't be cleared, and if you don't do your declarations, then your goods will not get through. Next slide, please. If you do want the detail, and say there is quite a lot of it, the government have produced their border operating model, as they term it, the latest iteration of which was published last week. There's a link to it on the screen, and I'm sure you'll get the slides if you haven't read it already. But it will tell you all you need to know about the detail, and it does that in just 314 closely typed pages. So if you haven't read it yet, you may just about have time to do so by the 1st of January if you start now. If you're shipping through Dutch ports, there's also a slightly simpler Dutch version of their preparations. And again, that link is on the slide. And if you're not shipping through Dutch ports in the Netherlands, well, you probably should be, because that's where all the ferries from Felixstowe and Harwich and the main dedicated short sea container service from Thamesport all go to the Netherlands. So that's the market with which we are most familiar also. Next slide, please. So what does it all mean for ports? So firstly, we have to, as I said, we have to control goods. There are two ways that we can do that: through temporary storage or pre-declaration, GVMS, as they're known, sort of interchangeably, same thing. How many of those goods will need inspecting? Indeed, what actually are we handling? Where will the goods be inspected? Who's going to inspect it? Are they ready for those inspections? Quite a lot still to do and still to get in place for next year. Next slide, please. So, controlling goods, as I said, from the 1st of January, all goods must be under control. And this is sort of in inverted commas. But what it means is that all goods will require a customs declaration. Ports won't be allowed to release goods until they're cleared. So unlike now, there'll be no letting goods through and then sort of the paperwork, if you like, catching up after the goods is gone. That's all going to have to be done before we can release the goods. And as I mentioned, there's two main models that we can follow: either temporary storage or pre-declaration GVMS. Now, whether or not the government cuts us any slack on day remains to be seen. But from figures that we've seen and heard from day one of export controls, the 1st of January this year, on day one, apparently 95% of all the consignments shipped for export were non-compliant in one way or another. That rate of non-compliance fell very quickly, something like sort of single figures, low single figures by the end of February. But if we have something similar for import traffic, some high levels of non-compliance initially, and we're not allowed to release goods until they are compliant, ports are going to face something of a challenge on day one. However, throughout this whole process, governments have been really clear about one thing, and that's that their absolute number one priority is protecting the flow of goods through ports. So we assume that they're going to be pragmatic, but we can't be sure quite how that will look. So I think the best thing that everyone can do is to make sure that you're fully prepared in advance, that either you or your customers have the wherewithal to submit their declarations promptly for all the consignments they're handling. Next slide, please, Will. So of those two models we can use, the first is what is termed temporary storage. This is actually what we do for all non-EU goods already. So it's a known, it's a tried and tested method of operating. Goods don't need to be pre-declared, but they can be if you want to be. Alternatively, they can be held for up to 3 months in an approved temporary storage location. I say in theory held for up to 3 months because in practice they're not. For container traffic, the average containers at the port for about 4 to 5 days. normally. For railroad traffic, though, once it comes in for railroad traffic, average unaccompanied trail, I mean, the accompanied trailers obviously go straight through the port. Unaccompanied trailers are here typically for around about 12 hours on average, although many are gone within almost minutes of arrival. So prompt flow of goods is really important, and we don't expect anything to be hanging around for too long. Once the ships do arrive, there's a terminology can cause some confusion here because there's the ship arrival and there's the customs arrival of the goods. And again, one of the things that HMRC announced just last week is that they're going to be arriving, in customs language, trailers 4 hours before the physical arrival of the ship. So that means people who are shipping their goods in unaccompanied trailers will know 4 hours before the vessel arrives whether or not they can collect those goods immediately on arrival, or whether or not they're going to go into or require some sort of customs control and check when they arrive. Next slide, please, Will. So pre-declarations, GVMS, this is a new procedure devised by HMRC. It was really done for the short sea traffic and the driver accompanied traffic, particularly through the Dover Straits, Dover-Calais and Eurotunnel. It only applies to railroad traffic. It had originally only going to be applied to accompanied railroad traffic, but Customs have announced now that it's possible that it could be used for unaccompanied traffic as well. For these, though, all goods must be declared. The customs declaration must be made prior to loading at the EU port. The ferry operator or Eurotunnel or whoever it might be is not allowed to load any vehicles or any consignments that have not been pre-declared. They're not cleared, arrived in that speak, until the vessel or train has left the EU, and also it can't be used for office of destination for transit traffic. The other important thing, I think, or two perhaps important things for GVMS is it doesn't avoid the potential for checks on arrival. That will be exactly the same under GVMS or temporary storage. The risking processes that customs and other agencies go through and the decision-making process on whether or not a consignment will be held or released are exactly the same for GVMS or temporary storage. So no change there. And I think the other factor that definitely needs to be borne in mind with this is that GVMS is a brand new government provided computer system. It's not really been tested in anger in any sense as yet. Next slide, please, Will. So all the physical interventions that are made at ports by the various border control agency, customs, port health, animal and plant health agency, environment agency, forestry commission, there's a whole myriad of them. They're all risk-based. The trouble is, though, to assess the risk, you sort of have to know what you're handling. Well, yeah, part of the challenge we've had in the last few months and years over that, and it's a slightly royal we here, it's ports, but it's also ferry operators, and particularly some of the government agencies, is knowing what it is that we are handling. Because what we handle really are, as you can see on the slide, they're trailers, they're lorries. We don't really know what's in them. Since the advent of the single market and free movement, there are no customs declarations made, so nobody really knows what's in these trailers, and it's been quite hard to work out what the risks are going to be, and therefore what sort of facilities we're going to need at the border. So what DEFRA have been doing, working with the ferry operators for a few months now, is sort of interrogating the manifests of the ferries to try and get an idea of what it is that is coming in to each of the ports on the ferries. But I think as many of you will know, manifest descriptions tend to be sort of free text, and they can vary quite significantly and are not always that precise anyway. But on the back of that, DEFRA have come up with a couple of iterations now of estimates that we've been able to use for planning purposes for our own facilities. Next slide, please, Will. So on the basis of those forecasts and predictions, we've created new border control post at Harwich. That's the one on the left with the red circle around it. And we've extended the existing BCP border control post at Felixstowe and modified the updated and modified the BCP that we have at London Thames Port. And we're also working very closely with the statutory agencies that are going to be undertaking these checks to make sure that everything is aligned. And we have, at Felixstowe, we're lucky, we have the largest port health department in the country, just there to support the existing container traffic through Felixstowe. They are a big and extremely experienced port health department. They're also going to be looking after the declarations and the SPS checks for us at Harwich. So there's relatively low risk there. Other locations, of course, that are only handling EU traffic don't have that same history and recent, or at least not for 30 or something years, experience of doing these checks. So I think we're in a very good place to help with trade once the full import controls come in place. Next slide, please, Will, or last slide, really. So that's all I had to say for now. I'll be happy to take any questions after I think Kevin has spoken. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much. If I can keep you for a minute, I will ask a couple of questions just while we launch our second poll. So I'm going to launch this now. And this is to ask you, our audience, how confident you are of a trouble-free transition to new import requirements next year. And the options there range from very confident, not at all confident, and include not very sure. Paul, thanks for the presentation. A really great overview of what's coming up. And I think the point you made around companies needing to ensure they're ready to do declarations to be prepared for whatever may happen. I think that was a really important point to make. I mean, we had a question come through from Harry, who's asked, are you at Hutchison Ports expecting any disruption at ports on either the 1st of January or at the different points when declarations and full controls are introduced respectively?
I think we're hoping not. I think we are speaking with HMRC already about contingency arrangements. I say the advantage that we have certainly at Felixstowe is 90% of our Felixstowe traffic is non-EU. So all those procedures and processes, border control procedures and processes are in place at Felixstowe. We can roll those out very easily to Harwich because it will be the same people overseeing the checks at both places. So we are comfortable that we're in a good place on that. But of course, and again, we'll all know that supply chains are quite complex integrated processes themselves, and each part of that needs to work well. And just at the risk of repeating myself, it is making those declarations is really important in the first place. If you don't make the declarations, nobody can clear your goods. So they risk being delayed. So I think that's really the key part. It's lots of people doing what they need to do at the right time will ensure that the border continues to work without any sort of additional friction.
Thanks, Paul. And there's a really interesting follow-up question from Santosh, who's asking around GVMS. And it's the point you're making actually around how it's the whole supply chains that are involved. So he said, GVMS requires cooperation of EU hauliers. If most EU hauliers have not registered with GVMS, will it be delayed? Now, you probably can't comment on whether GVMS will be delayed or not, but presumably that question really gets to the heart of it being really important to get your EU suppliers and hauliers aware of what their commitments are as well.
Yeah, and I mean, although we've had a number of delays already, and never say never, I think the body language of government and HMRC is that this time it's going to happen. I say what degree of, well, I think there will be a degree of pragmatism on day one, but it's not something that I think a well-run organisation would want to hang your hat on too much pragmatism. You want to be organised and have everything arranged in good time before then. But yes, there are multiple operators, not all of them UK-based operators, that will need to input data into the GVMS system and lodge the GMR, the goods movement reference, onto GVMS, which will allow the ferry operator to load that trailer at the EU side. So there will be a few challenges for a number of people.
It's really interesting. It's about ensuring the flow of goods, of course, but it's compliance as well. These are legal requirements which will be coming in. So thank you, Paul. We'll park the questions for now, and we'll continue later on with the Q&A. But just going to close that poll now and share the results. As ever, thank you everyone for answering. Really interesting. So not very many of you feeling very confident, only 5%. 35% of you feeling quite confident though. But yeah, a few more are feeling less sure. So 34% of you not very confident, 17% not at all confident, 9% not sure. So a mix of response there. And at this point, I'll close the poll, but it's next slide is on Kevin, I believe. Kevin, any surprises on that poll response? A real mix of readiness for the new rule requirements which are coming in.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a real mix, and I think it reflects different businesses in different circumstances. But I think, as Paul says, what businesses have to do is prepare. You can't hold your hat on that there may be further easements and there may not be full enforcement. We have to work on the basis from the 1st of January that the law is the law, and businesses must import compliantly. But most importantly, as well as compliance, is that all businesses and supply chains have to operate as efficiently as possible. So preparation becomes absolutely essential and key, and working with your stakeholders, whether that's hauliers, freight forwarders and customs agents, become key. As one of my favourite subjects, agree the Incoterms and make sure that your EU supplier is ready, because the state of readiness in the EU may not be particularly strong either. So preparation becomes absolutely essential.
So okay. Just before we go into the presentation, just a quick note. People asking questions, thank you. Loads of great questions coming through. If you can try to keep them concise, that would be really helpful, please, because it makes it easier for me to read the questions. So please try to keep it to one sentence if possible. Over to you, Kevin, though. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do now is take a slightly different view of third country requirements, so importing from the rest of the world, non-EU. And we often get asked this question, well, surely importing from the rest of the world is exactly the same as it's always been. Well, yes and no, depending again on the product, but also there have been some changes to trade and customs and certifications around importing, which we're going to look at. So I thought it would be very useful to look at that. And also at the Institute, we've done a lot of work this year with exporters overseas, including in various countries in the rest of the world, who are struggling potentially to understand the requirements of the EU, the EU and the UK. Well, have things changed? How does it affect my rest of world, my exports to the United Kingdom? So it's worth having a look at this. So if we have a next slide, please. So first of all, we're going to look at third country trade requirements. Next slide, please. Now, what we've done first of all here is produced a table. So next slide, please. So on the table, what we've tried to indicate is what's the same as in 2021 or 2020, and what is different. So what's really changed since the 1st of January? Well, yes, there are, and we can see some ticks here as in same and different. What we can see here is tariffs on imported goods. Yes, they still apply outside of a trade agreement. And it is worth noting that the UK is negotiating more trade agreements with the likes of Australia and New Zealand, and the UK is applying to join TPP as well in terms of some elements of trans-Pacific trade. So if there are trade agreements, then tariffs may apply at reduced levels or even at zero levels. But the UK has established a global import tariff, so there are differences in tariffs between the UK global import tariff and the EU common external tariff. And I've got a slide on that very shortly. The UK has its own tariff rate quota, so there's been a split with the EU, so for certain agricultural products. Now, it's still a requirement for customs declarations and safety and security declarations. That hasn't changed. Incoterms, as I've indicated, remain as important as ever, and different sets of Incoterms generally tend to apply for short sea crossings to the EU as opposed to deep sea to likes of India, China, Brazil, and so on. So businesses mustn't just think one Incoterm fits all, because there are different requirements depending on where you're shipping to or receiving the goods from, which can have fundamental differences. Mutual recognition schemes still apply for some countries, and I'll give an example of that shortly. If we have the next slide, please. So next slide is just a continuation. It's very important that businesses select the correct commodity code, origin of the goods, and customs valuations remain as important as ever. And certainly what we would stress from the EU is that if you are receiving goods and you have a statement of origin on the commercial invoice from the EU exporter, you have to evidence importer's knowledge. Now, if it's for example, French cheese, brie, then it's probably fairly obvious that it is of EU origin. But other component parts, textiles, automotive, for example, just because the exporter has put EU origin on there doesn't necessarily mean it definitely is. And so it's based on importers' knowledge, and importers will be subject to compliance checks by customs authorities, because clearly with the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, it has to be EU origin for 0 rates of duty to apply. So that could in some cases require supplier declarations. So happy to take questions on that. Health certificates and phytosanitary certificates are still required, but as I'm going to indicate, the UK's requirements on health certificates, and there's different templates that apply. Import pre-notification is still required, but now for a system called IPAFs, as opposed to previously traces before 2021. And we now have postponed VAT accounting, which applies in the UK, not just for the EU, but for rest of world goods. So that's been quite a significant change. So those are some of the trade requirements that have changed. So it's very important to note that change in the rest of the world has taken place. Should we have a next slide, please? So I talked about the UK global import tariff. So these are tariffs, as I've indicated, outside of a free trade agreement or outside of trade preferences. So if the goods haven't been received from a generalised system of preferences GSP country, such as Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, for example. And the UK has set its tariff rates, and some of those tariff rates in a previous webinar, the Institute have gone through this a lot, have changed. So some of the tariffs, some of the nuisance tariffs below 2% have been withdrawn, and there's been some simplification of tariffs or rounding down of tariffs from the EU tariff. But one of the most important elements is semi-finished goods component parts. Effectively, some of those are 0 tariffs, like screws, nuts and bolts, to help supply chains, and that's what's different from the EU supply chain. Now, finished goods will always be heavily tariffed, and that hasn't changed, whether it's the EU or the UK. But the argument is the UK's global import tariff, depending on the product and the semi-component part, is slightly more competitive than the EU. If we have the next slide, please. Now, next slide in terms of bilateral agreements is interesting. So the UK quite early on with some countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, for example, continued the bilateral agreements which were in place with the EU, which allows a product's conformity requirements such as testing, inspection, certification to be undertaken in the export country, in this case Australia's example. And this is interesting because the UK now is continually looking at what we call trade corridors. So building out our trade agreements to create trade corridors to simplify trade. So whether that could be from a customs perspective or a conformity perspective, there is a lot of work going on. What's not clear at the moment is whether that will have to be built on the authorised economic operator, AEO, mutual recognition agreements. So the UK has various MRAs, unauthorised economic operator, the likes of Australia, UK, New Zealand, and it's going to be interesting to see how they build out and whether it's going to have to be AEOs that benefit from trade corridors, or whether it's going to be wider, and that's something that's interesting. So the UK is very the Institute on behalf of the UK is heavily involved in trade corridor work with Kenya and with Singapore at the moment, to try and build out this concept of an easier, freer flow with traceability in the supply chain as well. So interesting to see how these bilateral agreements, these mutual recognition agreements, will be built out, and it should be a feature of trade in the next few years. If we have the next slide, please. So we're now going to look at some considerations for specific products. Paul has referred to these, so I'm not going to go through every slide in detail. I'm just going to pick out some considerations. So if we have the next slide, please. So if we start, clearly a lot of talk around animal products and products of animal origin. And again, you know, this applies not just from the European Union, it applies from goods from the rest of the world as well. So the requirement for import pre-notification through a new system, IPAS, which has replaced traces, becomes really important. And Paul referred to the BCPs, the border control posts. They very much remain for rest of world trade, and clearly we have the new ones and the enhanced ones for EU trade when there will be controls at the border. If we have the next slide, please. So again, these slides will be available to you. There may be some of you already who are already registered on IPAS, but there are details there about how you can register using your existing government gateway account to effectively create a new DEF account. So that's if you need to register for IPAS. And we must also note the growth in e-commerce, the seasonality of business with Christmas, the Chinese New Year, where there could be some businesses here who haven't necessarily had to encounter these requirements, but they will do going forward, or businesses starting to take part in supply chains and importing and exporting for the very first time. So we have a next slide, please. So as I say, the concept of import pre-notification. So it has to be this pre-advice of imports, and Paul obviously referred to temporary storage. What we all want as businesses is for goods to clear customs. So in some cases, as we said, with both animal products, with horticultural products of certain sorts, import pre-notification becomes key. And what also becomes key is to link the IPAS reference as well. So for those businesses who are importing from the EU who haven't maybe had to make that import pre-notification, linking the IPAS reference to the customs declaration becomes absolutely key. And if you're using, say, a customs agent, you're going to have to engage with that customs agent to give them the IPAS reference. So there's a number of things which are going to be new, and the linkages between the various references for likes of IPAS, customs declarations, then from July next year, the import safety and security declaration, which all has to connect. Sometimes I use the example from the EU that we're not fully importing from the EU at the moment, not in the same way as we are for the rest of the world, that we're going to have to get used to these new procedures. So managing that whole end-to-end supply chain, working with our European supplier becomes key. So we have a next slide, please. So the CHED, the Common Health Entry Document, is created using IPAS with different CHEDs, P and D, depending on the actual nature of the goods. The intention, and it's gone relatively quiet on this, is IPAS is due to replace Peaches, but I think the priority at the moment is to try and get IPAS ready for EU movements from the 1st of January. So if we have the next slide, please. Export health certificates, as we said, are required, and it's very important that not just from the EU, definitely from the 1st of July next year, but also from the rest of the world, that everyone is clear on the type of export health certificate required. They can vary. And yes, that is the responsibility of the supplier invariably to produce that export health certificate. But also remember, from the 1st of January next year, compliance is going to become a lot more important. So there's going to be a lot more checking of documents. If we have a next slide, please. So import pre-notification is also required for certain plants, horticultural elements, and even machinery and vehicles as well. So linked to agricultural or forestry products. So further things to bear in mind. Next slide, please. Exporters clearly must obtain a phytosanitary certificate. In terms of the rest of the world, that really hasn't changed. But inspection referred to in the certificate must take place no more than 14 days before consignment is dispatched. So if you are an infrequent importer, again, working with your overseas exporter to make sure that they're clear on requirements becomes key. Next slide, please. Food labelling. Now, we talk about food labelling a lot in the context of the EU and with the immediate changes on food labelling, food business operator, but we can't forget the UK as well. So, businesses, whilst they can continue to use a EU GB or NI Northern Ireland address, that is until the 30th of September next year. So from the 1st of October, it must include a UK address for the food business operator. So again, that becomes very important. And it also, same with the rest of the world is at the moment, we must remember that the food business operator is the organisation responsible for bringing the goods into the United Kingdom. So there is a responsibility which goes just beyond the customs and just goes beyond selling it, is that the quality of the goods, the quality of what's been imported and any risks very much lies with the food business operator. So if you are an importer or a distributor and you are the food business operator, it's very, very important to recognise that. Next slide, please. So final slide is worth mentioning is the UK CA marking. Again, we think about this more in the context of the EU and the CE marking in the EU, but we mustn't remember there's been a delay or further delay to the 1st of January 2023 that the UK CA marking requirement will come in. So and that's important both for yourselves if you're bringing goods in that are subject such as electrical goods, machinery, and it's also very important for your exporter as well that they're aware of the requirements of needing to meet UK conformity. And whilst we're now just over a year away, we must start preparing. So sooner to prepare the better, rather than leaving everything to the last minute. So thank you very much indeed for listening to me. I'll pass back for another poll. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. As ever, lots of useful information there. I hope everyone has found that useful. On the next slide, you'll see that there is another poll. Someone's going to launch that now. And that's going to ask you how confident you are about trading with the EU in a post-Brexit environment. Options again range from very confident, not at all confident, and there's a not sure option 2. So we are also in the Q&A now as well, so there's going to be another poll in a minute, but we're going to do questions during these polls. Just a quick heads up, everyone. I've had a few questions in around origin and origin supply declarations and all that side of things. We actually have 2 webinars on Thursday, one a member lunchtime learning and one of our public webinars. The member webinar is on the easement for supply declarations. That's at, let me just check the time, that's at 12 on Thursday. And then a webinar more generally around rules of origin and how to make use of them for imports from the EU is at 11, and that one's free to the public. So 2 excellent resources for more information on origin coming your way on Thursday. Kevin, we've had loads of questions, so I'm going to ask this one from Anthony, which is a goodie. He's asked, can we import finished goods from the EU and then re-export them to the EU with no significant change, duty-free for both ourselves and our final customer? So Kevin, it's a question on re-exports.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a good question. So under terms of the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the concept of bilateral accumulation does apply. However, it doesn't apply for finished goods. So what the EU was concerned about is the UK would just become, if you like, a distribution centre. where it would sort of take goods in and then send them out. So under terms of the trade and cooperation agreement, there has to be significant processing, substantial transformation. So taking finished goods in, let's say, for example, taking goods from, say, the Netherlands into Great Britain and then exporting them or selling them to Ireland. If there is no transformation, then import duties will apply when those goods are exported to to Ireland. So import duties will apply based on the EU Common External Tariff. If there is transformation, then effectively the rules of bilateral accumulation will apply. But again, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has examples of what is deemed sufficient transformation and what is not. So likes of painting, polishing, repackaging, labelling is insufficient transformation. Now, there may be some examples which returns goods relief could be looked at, or customs warehousing could be looked at, but customs warehousing invariably would have to be done under a transit procedure. But it's quite complex and it requires lots of codes that effectively the original MRN movement reference number. So it could apply intercompany perhaps, but it's not as easy as it seems. Now, we're taking lots and lots of our questions from members. We have supported some of our members on returns goods relief and customs warehousing and transit, but it's not an easy area. So again, certainly for members, and please contact the Institute because it's an area that we're having to provide a lot of support on. But great question, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And a related question is from Frances, who's asked around customs special procedures in general. So she's asked, could you say something about customs procedures, what they are, how they can help traders to be more efficient with new rules? So yeah, could you say a little bit about customs special procedures, please?
Yeah, it's I guess customs special procedures, I'll use a couple of examples. Again, what we've seen at the Institute, we provide a lot of companies with support if they're importing goods maybe from China, from Thailand or other Asian countries, for example, or from Brazil or even from the United States. If they're subject to sufficient transformation, so when you bring goods in, first of all, so let's say you bring it as a distribution business, you can hold them in a customs warehouse. If you're undertaking processing, you can apply for a special procedure, inward processing. And under that, the duty is suspended. If the goods are then re-exported, for example, to the European Union, then effectively that import duty that would have applied, so China, India, for example, Brazil, then that is removed. So that is one benefit of taking those goods in and then re-exporting them, is that import duty is eliminated. Now, clearly there's still an issue if it's just customs warehousing, is it just becomes effectively a distribution business and it's not UK origin, so there will be tariffs in the EU that will apply. But if you are undertaking sufficient processing and meet the rules of, say, inward processing, then it could be there will be no import duties in the EU because it then defers as UK origin. Again, a very complex area, but it's an area where we've seen lots of businesses apply for inward processing and customs warehousing. And again, it's an area that we'd be very happy to provide further information on. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Yes, on the website, under our training and consultancy offerings, you can see there's some of the support we provide around customs special procedures and gaining authorization to use them. I'm just going to close that poll though. It's really interesting actually, so it's kind of slightly in contrast to the question earlier. There's a lot more confidence around trade in general with the EU in a post-Brexit environment, despite some of the earlier uncertainty around the rules. So 59% quite confident, 9% very confident. So a good majority there are feeling confident. Only 2% are not at all confident, but 17% not very. Is that a surprise, Kevin? It's obviously earlier there's more of a mixed response to how ready people felt around the rules, but people confident around trade anyway. Is that a surprise to you?
I guess yes and no. So hopefully one of the benefits of the webinar today has been to sort of outline some procedures, and hopefully for some businesses and organisations it's helped to validate. What we would stress again is that businesses that are compliant and businesses doing things right can gain competitive advantage. So the more you know, the more knowledge you have, the greater the competitive advantage. An increase in the United Kingdom, not just UK and globally, as we move towards this concept of trusted trader, businesses with clean, good compliance records, that compliance will move towards competitive advantage. So, so for those of you quite confident, obviously check you've got all your standard operating procedures, you've got all your records in place. But I'm obviously pleased that there's been some benefit. Thank you.
And to bring in Paul on that poll response, Paul, does that reassure you from the port's perspective about the upcoming changes? There is that confidence?
Yeah, I think it does. I think one thing we've learned is that trade is incredibly resilient, and that businesses adapt quickly when they have to adapt. So I think I think some businesses are probably not fully focused on what they need to do yet, but once they focus, they'll be able to do it, and they'll be able to do it very quickly. So yeah, I think we are confident on that. And whilst I'm speaking, can I just come back on this one point that Kevin mentioned about the previous questions about importing, re-exporting of goods. And I think there's a future webinar on free ports, but it would be remiss of me not to mention that at Felixstowe and Harwich, we're part of Freeport East. And of course, one advantage is that free ports will offer are for goods coming in from, rest of the world, going back out to the EU. And one of the advantages of we see of Freeport East is that sort of springboard into Europe type approach, where the benefits of customs warehousing and inward processing can be combined into a single sort of Freeport entity there. So I think there is a read across to the Freeport debate in that as well.
It's really interesting. We had a question in from David actually, who asked, what do you think the impact of free ports will be on the areas which have been selected to become free ports? I mean, could you say a little bit more about, Paul, in terms of what you anticipate for Freeport East as an example?
Yeah, I think it's, well, I guess, in one sense, taking obviously it remains to be seen quite what the impact of free ports will be. But I think for Freeport East, there are two main areas where we see Freeport East offering, something meaningful to British businesses. One is that import-export side of things. We're combining in Freeport East. We've got obviously the Port of Felixstowe. I mentioned at the beginning, 40% of all UK trade, container trade, is already going through Felixstowe, particularly strong in trade with Asia. So people bringing in goods from Asia for some form of processing, finishing, kitting out, whatever, and then using the Freeport as a centre to distribute into Europe from, I think we're really attractive. We've got a number of short sea container services from Felixstowe. Between Felixstowe and Harwich, we've got 7 daily ferry services into Europe. So I think there'll be a real strong proposition there that we can offer. And the other side of things is the offshore wind and energy market. Harwich has already been involved in construction projects for 3 of the existing wind farms. The UK, as you'll know, has a very ambitious programme of development in offshore wind and increasing the UK content in those wind farms. So we're going to have a green energy hub at Harwich and developing hydrogen applications in the transport sector there as well. So yeah, a two-pronged approach for Freeport East, if you like, import-export trade and green energy.
It's very encouraging to hear. Thanks, Paul, and thank you for the answer to David's question as well. I'm just going to hide that poll. We do have one other poll on the next slide, which is just an opportunity for you to say if you'd like to find out more about how Hutchison Ports and the Port of Felixstowe, amongst Harwich and others, can support your business. You can opt in for using this poll here. But while that poll is ongoing, again, I'll just keep on doing some questions. I mean, Paul, obviously you're talking about a little bit about what's coming up in the future, but in the more recent history, Deborah has asked a question alluding to some of the difficulties faced by ports in the last year or so, with obviously there's been congestion issues and storage issues throughout 2021 and some of 2020. How are the ports looking at the moment in terms of that kind of global issue, and how do you think that will intersect with the new rules which are coming in the start of next year?
I think they're largely two separate things. They're on what we've seen this year. I think there was a combination of factors for ports. Then part of that was global, and there's been great disruption in global supply chains. So the overwhelming majority, virtually all of the ships arriving at the port are off schedule. Many are 2 or 3 weeks late before they get here. We operate the ports a little bit like airports or railway stations in a sense. All the container services are scheduled. They all have a fixed time of arrival or a planned time of arrival and time of departure. And when we're working smoothly, as one ship leaves, the next ship should just be sort of hoving into view over the horizon to come onto the berth. When they're all off schedule, that doesn't happen so well. So sometimes you have clashes of ships' arrival. Sometimes you might have gaps between them. But we work very closely with our shipping line partners to minimize that. And the other side of it, almost literally, is the inland side. And I think the whole supply chain there, obviously, and it's had a lot of publicity around it, with driver shortages, also inland warehouse and distribution centres suffering from labour shortages as well, means that the whole of supply chain has become slightly clogged in that there are goods that aren't getting out of the distribution centres to the retailers quickly enough because they can't get the haulage. That's leading to a build-up of goods in distribution centres, so they can't take them from the port so quickly. Even when they've got space, sometimes they can't get the haulage. So again, that's seen a build-up of containers in ports. But having said all of that, at the moment, the situation's a lot better than it has been for some time. Actually, in our import space at the port, the utilisation of that is getting back to where it would normally be. So I think we're looking a lot better than we were. But I think the European traffic and the EU changes we're going to see, 95% of our container traffic is non-EU, whereas 100% of our roll-on, roll-off traffic is EU. So, physically, those two operations are separate within the port. So I don't see one affecting the other. They may both occur at the same time, but they're not really interrelated.
Thanks, Paul. That's a really interesting answer, and good to hear things have been getting a bit better recently. So that's encouraging, but obviously lots of challenges ahead. A few questions we've had in on GVMS. I'll do the most succinct one, which is from Sylvia, who's asked, how can EU suppliers support the smooth movement of goods on GVMS? So I don't know, Kevin, do you want to start on that question?
It's a really, really good question, actually, because if you like, the working assumption is GVMS, the responsibility will be the haulier, the EU haulier, and again, there could be problems there in terms of the level of awareness of what GVMS is for the actual EU haulier. So how can the EU supplier help? Well, I think the EU supplier has to obviously try and create awareness with the haulier of the requirements for GVMS. So they need to make sure that the EU haulier registers on the UK GVMS system. And I remember hearing some stats last week that it's extremely low, the actual registration of EU hauliers. So the EU supplier should be making it very clear that the EU haulier is responsible for carrying their goods, and they have a responsibility to act and prepare and not wait for the last minute to turn up at a port and then suddenly find that the goods will not be allowed on the vessel. So that's one aspect of it as well. So that preparation becomes absolutely fundamental. Obviously the EU, that clearly depends on the Incoterms, of course. It really becomes important. And I think what we might see is clearly that those hauliers or those freight forwarders that are more efficient will probably gain more business, whereas those hauliers who are, let's say, just assuming it's going to be the same on the 1st of January next year as it is today, are going to have problems. So I think the best thing if you're a GB importer is to let your EU supplier know that their EU haulier must find out about what GVMS is. There's enough information on the UK sites, and they must register for GVMS.
Just one last question before we go, because we are running out of time now. It's just a great opportunity to ask Paul, obviously you're very much on the front line. How have you seen trade flows shifting as a result of Brexit over the last year, and do you foresee any kind of major changes coming up with the new import rules coming in?
Good question, William. Yeah, we've had a couple of false dawns already, where we had potential for no-deal Brexits, and we certainly saw then a certain amount of stockpiling before then, so some sort of mini surges in traffic. The other thing that we've already seen evidence of is people spreading the risk a little bit, if you like. So people tending to move away or lowering their reliance on the short sea routes. Again, yeah, there's been quite a lot in the media around those, and the expectation that those shortest crossings might be the most problematic in a Brexit situation. So we've seen people using other routes, such as those into Felixstowe and Harwich. We've seen some people moving back towards short sea container as option, as opposed to roll on, roll off. Again, prior to the single market and customs union, there were a lot more short sea container operations. They're not as quick door to door, but they're more predictable in many ways, and they're free of those delays. You can build in time into the process, and of course you have a lesser need for hauliers than you do on the driver accompanied as well, and obviously hauliers are in short supply, and for that same reason we're also seeing a little bit of a move from sort of accompanied to unaccompanied traffic as well, to make better use of hauliers' time. So there are some shifts, spreading the load a little bit more, moving slightly more towards short sea containers and more towards unaccompanied traffic as well, that we're already seeing some evidence of all of those.
That's really interesting, and yeah, again, it's all such a big picture at the moment. It's really great to get your insights on that, Paul. So thank you very much. We have run out of time, I'm afraid, so we are going to start to wrap things up. But thanks again to Kevin and Paul for the presentations today. Really interesting to see kind of the impact of Brexit so far, but also to hear how much things are still to change. So I hope that's been useful, everyone. A reminder on the final slide, as mentioned just a few minutes ago, we are doing one more webinar with Hutchison as part of this current series. It's about Freeport East and the potential benefits of Freeports for traders in the east of England and generally as well. That's going to be in January, and you can find sign-up details on export.org.uk/webinars. Just while talking about our upcoming webinars, on that same URL, you'll see the Rules of Origin webinars I mentioned earlier, and I'll soon be posting a sign-up details for a GVMS webinar we're doing in early December too, which will be of interest to many people who've asked questions about that today. So keep your eyes peeled for that one. I mentioned earlier we were going to say something about our training consultancy offerings. We didn't get around to it today, but if you are interested in more support, please go to export.org.uk. Should all be there, and yeah, there's lots of information about how we can support you. For now, though, thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one. But for now, goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Thanks all.